Signals present a Bon Mott's Halloween series, celebrating 6 decades of horror.
To perform an autopsy first.
With in-depth analysis.
That's much too vulgar display of power.
Adult content.
I did hurt him, okay?
Adult language.
You gotta come work for me.
And spoilers.
Mrs. French's cat is missing.
Join us.
All you can do is pass it along to someone else.
And as a finale to MOTS-O-Ween, this Saturday we will be doing a live review Halloween, the movie, at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on our YouTube channel. So please come join us.
Good evening, and on the second day of MOTS-O-Ween, we got an offering of a 1970s horror film called The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin, based upon the book, and the screenplay is written by William Peter Blatty. And Ian, would you like to start us off?
Wait, synopsis? Scott, you want to do a synopsis first?
Alright, I play a little game with myself. Every time there was an opportunity to insert the line, could it be Satan? So that's pretty much the plot of this film, because it was Satan, as we'll get to.
Yeah. Or like a riff off of Upright Citizens Brigade. Science knows nothing. Satan
is everything, of course, yes.
Okay, very good. Well, okay, we're going to start off with the introduction. As you all well know, this movie is about an exorcist, a priest, and a younger priest, named Father Marin, and a movie star and her daughter Regan, and her daughter Regan is possessed. So, Ian, would you like to give us a brief introduction on the introduction?
Sure thing. Now, when I was initially watching this movie, I was going to say that the introduction was almost a three-parter, because I felt that they were establishing all of the main characters piece by piece. Basically, they have this prolonged segment in Iraq where an older priest is on a dig, and you kind of his heart trouble. You get to see actually really cool shots of like Iraq and the culture there. I believe it's around Nineveh.
I think it just said northern Iraq.
No, but later on they mentioned that.
Oh, they do. I didn't catch that.
When the priests in the are discussing where he is at, I think they mentioned Nineveh. But I don't believe he's actually a main character here. So then they set up the movie star and the Damien, the father. The younger priest. So I was going to say that entire thing was the introduction, but I have to now cut out those other two parts because the older priest wasn't really a major player in this movie. So, and not until the very end at least. So the introduction was solely in Iraq. And as much as I loved the shots of it, as much as I loved I don't think it had a point to the rest of the movie. And I don't know, Scott, you seem to want to interject there.
I see what you mean completely, but I think I liked it even in spite of that. I want to say, the shots were excellent. It was almost like an Indiana Jones setup. That's what I got out of it first.
But I think it's out of a different movie.
I understand you're saying it's not quite relevant, but I thought of it this way, right? Imagine if you're reading a novel. It was a nice a cold open, if you will, and then it totally goes away from that character, but he comes back and has an important part to play later on in the plot. Yeah. So in that sense, I felt that it was a good setup, and I liked the introduction.
It seems like they were setting up like the artifact that he found as being, where the demon or whatever comes from.
They're setting up Satan.
But that actually doesn't have anything to do with why. Right, but I still think the little girl is.
If they wanted to, they could have established this character when they're when the two priests are talking later on in the movie, where is he? They could have shown him in Iraq at that point, and every scene of someone coming up telling him they need him back in the States before
maybe, but
that would have done all of what the introduction established without having 20 minutes of it. As much as it's shot beautifully, but could it have been cut out of the film? I think so.
I think you're right in that sense, but actually I think one of the I'm not sure if that would have worked exactly, because I think the point was that the younger priest, what's his last name?
The younger priest is Father Marin. We're talking about
no, the younger priest is Damien.
Oh, sorry.
Marin
the younger
is the old priest.
Yeah, right. Sorry.
What's Damien's last name?
I don't know.
Whatever. Damien says that he wants to do the exorcism, and they're like, well, let's see if we have somebody closer around. And then because that guy had come back from Iraq, because Marin had come back from Iraq, that's why he was the one to do it, as opposed to Damien.
That's true. They do mention that. They made sure that's established. They say something like Marin has done an exorcism 10, 12 years ago, something like that. But either way, like, I still think it's fine. Like, it didn't. I see what you mean. It's almost like a Dan Brown kind of thing, like where they like, we need Professor whoever, like, let's get him on the phone. Like,
but it's not egregious.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
I enjoyed watching the scenes, but we were joking that this movie's 2 hours and 1 minute, and I'm like, I think I have
which minute could be cut out. Yeah.
I realized I can cut out a lot. Like, if we really wanted to streamline this, it really had almost no relevance to the later story.
I see what
I completely disagree.
I
absolutely
mean.
Positively disagree, because I consider this movie, amongst other things, a character study. And actually, in a lot of ways, the focal point of the film is Damien Karras. And Father Marin and the two priests I consider to be, the main character studies. Reagan and is the little girl, and her mom, Chris. I consider them in a way like the catalyst. I consider them like the through line, because their story was pretty. I mean, it was interesting that they chose her to be an actress, and that the film opens up. Yes. Sorry, I don't want to get ahead of things, but it takes place around a movie set in Georgetown, and I really like the juxtaposition where you've got these two priests going through real things, and you've got this woman from Hollywood all of a sudden having to face this real thing.
Yeah, but to that point, though, if it is a character study, and this is important to whether the introduction means anything in the long run, when you think of this priest, do you think of him as a world-traveling archaeologist, or do you think of him as a stern, old guard, I've done this before? And again, it establishes, I guess, his credentials of having traveled the world and been experienced. But does that extended opening in Iraq really add to his character?
I think it does, because I think it's not that he's stern or that he's this globe-trotting archaeologist. He's searching for some kind of proof. And he was doing missionary work in Africa when he came across his first exorcism. And that would have set him on a course of finding out the nature of evil, finding out if demons, Satans are real. I mean, it was a test of his faith, and then it was a test of Karras' faith later on a different level.
He did say when he finds it, he unearthed the little relic statue, like a carving, and when he goes back to catalog it, he mutters to himself, "Evil against evil," or "evil to protect against evil." Like, I thought that was a nice little detail to include. I just want to comment, like, to add to what you said. I think that does speak to that's who his character was and why that was there in the setup.
But it also kind of gives validity to what happens later in the movie in terms of how Reagan's diagnosed, which I won't get into now.
But I don't think that has anything to do with who this guy is and if the introduction's meaningful. I feel that if they had shot him in Africa, not necessarily doing an exorcism, but performing services to the thing, that would have added just as much credentials as the later things.
So I think the question is, like, what do you think that the opening added to the film plot wise that wasn't there otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, again, I see your point completely. I just don't think I'm quite there on your side of it. I'm somewhere between you guys. I still liked it overall. I think you're saying, does it add something to his character? I think it adds enough. Does it add what you want it to? Maybe could have been cut down. I kind of agree with that.
Is he even? Well, we'll get to character, but I don't think he's even all that important of a character in the story.
Well, we'll disagree about that later.
A lot of what this is, it also set up like the tone of the movie, the style, which we'll get into later. But I thought it was very, very important because if you were to doing smaller things and a lot of intercuts, that's what happens nowadays. You introduce a character. All right, when Father Marin comes in the house, you introduce the character, and then, like, during rest, you have flashbacks. It's very distracting. This film took place over a few months. We start off with Karras' story. We go to Georgetown. We follow, and the time jumps I find are interesting in the film. And I do think that introduction, the whole introduction, really just kind of set the tone for the overall film in many, many ways. And one of them is introducing Father Marin, so you could get the exposition out of the way.
Like, I think it was the Omen who did a similar thing with maybe it was somewhere where they find like an artifact that leads to an issue later
links
on.
To the
right, and that would
that
would have been a much more important part of the plot if that anything that he found there or did there affected anything else, but it really didn't, right? So this is just like a completely cold open. He is in Iraq, and then they cut to Georgetown.
And an hour and a half later, he appears.
He shows up again, but nothing that he did in Iraq matters at all to the story.
But I mean, because that's not the point. It's not some kind of like bullshit you'd see now, honestly, where somebody finds this thing and then...
but is it narratively a good...
Yeah, I think it's very... because what I was saying before about his character, it shows the background. It shows, like, if there is evil, if there are demons, the devil, they're all around. They're not going to be connected to necessarily to one place. You don't need a talisman. Well, all right, the Ouija board, yeah, another thing. But you don't need the companion talisman to what Marin found in the desert at the beginning of the film.
Maybe not, but it sets something up about his character, which I'll speak to when we get to that question, that I think is relevant, and we'll discuss more there.
All right, so are we going to give scores?
Yep, go ahead.
Well, I was initially going to give this a soft 1, but I kind of convinced myself to knock it down to a 0.
I'm giving it a solid, decent 1.
I'm going to give this a 1 on the strength of the other openings, where I love the style of how the whole Iraq scene was shot. I do agree that there are kind of 3 intros to this film, and you introduce the characters, and I think the real introduction is to Reagan and what's her mother's name? Chris. And
the McNeils.
To counter that, though, like, I feel that the point that this is kind of a completely secondary storyline makes those two not introductions.
But it's not even a storyline.
No, but it's like,
the whole beginning is not a storyline at all.
Since it's something on its own, it's in a sense a cold opening, and thus that would be the entire introduction. I don't think you can say that
a cold opening qualifies as intro. Yeah.
After that counts as a full part of the introduction.
I don't know if I agree with that. The introduction to the so that intro scene, if I think about it, and you lopped off that intro scene, the intro in Georgetown would have made a perfectly fine open to the movie, which I see as the introduction. Like, I see that whole beginning part in Iraq as like as a prologue, basically.
Yeah.
But isn't the prologue an introduction?
Yeah, but if you were going to say the introduction of a book, would you say that the prologue is the first part of the book?
Yes.
I would say that the intro is when you first start the story. You wouldn't say that's an introduction?
Yes, of course. I think it's
Stephen,
one of the
if
same.
I were going by your scale, I would agree. I think we're on the same page, but I just can't.
You guys are cutting it off differently.
I look at it as a prologue, which I don't and have never thought of as part of the main story. A prologue can affect the main story and can speak to the main story, but it's not the main story. That's why it's a prologue and not chapter 1. You know.
I mean, yes, it could be the case. Sometimes not. Let me just give you guys an example. I think we all familiar with this. The prologue to the first Game of Thrones is the zombies in the wall.
I know exactly.
Like that, I think will count as the introduction in quotes.
Well, Steve,
that's all I'm saying. And so I think it's the same case here.
Since you're claiming that's part of the introduction, would you mind telling the audience like what happened in those first 2 introduction scenes?
Well, a lot of it was, so I don't remember exactly when Damien says that he doesn't have faith anymore, but that's pretty early. I can't remember if that's in his introduction scene or not.
I actually can answer. It starts off with Georgetown, the movie set, and Chris McNeil is getting ready to go do her part. And she's talking with Burke Dennings, the director, right. And they share a joke and they hug, and then the crowd around him laughs, and Damien's in the crowd.
Yeah,
like he's there, and it's like you establish Chris in the movie set, and then the camera follows Damien.
Right, it's her on set in the beginning, and then like the whole like film like that kind of meta commentary about like
film in a film.
Yeah,
and he goes to visit his mother right afterwards.
Yes,
yes, and then she goes home to her.
That's right. It's after, so it's definitely not in the his introduction scene when he says that he's lost his faith. But
I felt that him interacting with his mother tells you everything you need to know about his character.
Right. So I'm gonna keep it a 1. I still think that part is completely a prologue. It has nothing to do with the story. All right. So that's my 1.
Fair enough.
You know, I'm going. Sorry to get you off, but I'm going to go by Steven's scale. You convinced me. So.
Oh shit!
Ooh, that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, I was leaning towards the beginning with, but nonetheless,
all right.
I'll give credit where credit's due.
Fair enough.
I give it a really strong 1. I think it sets the tone visually of the movie. I think that sets the tone. It sets the tone in that there are supernatural forces in the universe. No matter how slight it is, like stopping the pendulum from a clock going. I think instead of it gets a lot of Marin's exposition out of the way, it kind of explains who he is, that when you find out that he did this exorcism 12 years earlier, you kind of feel like he's journeyed to find something, and that he accepts this exorcism because even in his poor health, because it's kind of like the culmination of his research. It's proof of, or it's verification that what happened to him 12 years earlier.
But you don't find that out in the introduction.
No, but what I'm saying is that I'm disagreeing with you in that I think the introduction is important, because I do consider this a character study, and I think that's really important.
I completely get what you're saying, that you find the whole Iraq scene to be important to his character. However, you can't use finding out that he, did an exorcism 12 years ago as part of your, reason to give the introduction of one.
But in any narrative, they don't give everything away at the beginning.
Yeah, but that has nothing to do with
but that would be part of your body score, or whatever. Like, we're just judging the intro right now.
Right, and you said that the intro doesn't affect anything in the story, and I'm saying I disagree that it does. That it gives you the necessary information on Karras, so when later on he is discussed, it fills out a complete picture. Without that introduction, when they bring him up, 2/3 into the film, Marin, when they bring him up 2/3 into the film, you wouldn't have, there would have been really nothing, about, who this man is.
Sure. But I don't know if
we're all vaguely agreeing to disagree.
I think they could have done his I think, as Ian said, they could have done that later on, and it would have been fine. Like,
maybe.
And it could have had more to do with the actual story.
One last thing, you can liken it. I can kind of liken it to the beginning of 2001, but I think 2001 spoke more to an evolution rather than a character through line. So, all right. So if we're done discussing that, Scott, would you like to tell us about the body of this movie?
Sure. So it's long. Like, I agree in the same sense that Ian said, like, it was 2 hours and 1 minute. A couple of minutes could be cut out of, like, various scenes throughout the body. But I think it held together very well. It was a bit of a slow burn, I guess I want to say. But that was fine because, once it started once everything came together, I guess in the last, like, say, 60, 70%, it was perfectly fine. And everything else that had come before built up to it. So I'll give it, credit on that. Ian wants to say something.
As Scott didn't actually go into what happens in the body.
Well, I was going to afterwards. So they as Chris mentioned earlier, they do a bunch of time jumps where Reagan is getting sicker and sicker, and she's taken to doctors, she's taken to various, like, psychiatrists and so forth, and hypnotists, and nobody can see. There's no explanation as to what's happening aside from possession, which is obvious to everybody, to the audience, but not every other characters in the film, which eventually leads them to, or her mother, to cross paths and implore a priest's help, Damien's, that is, and he's given Marin as sort of his partner because of the introduction thing. He has experience with it, so they start to investigate, have a sort of inquisition, if you will, whether or not it's a legitimate, in quotes, case for an exorcist, and they end up doing it. Marin dies during that.
Well, that's the conclusion.
I would say it's part of the
I
climax.
don't think it is.
Maybe the climax could start right after.
We'll disagree there a bit.
I would say the conclusion begins when they actually start performing the exorcism.
Well,
maybe
that's something
I think
that
that's Act 2.
for sure.
But either way, I think it all holds together very well, regardless. And even though some of it seemed like, at times it seemed a bit slow, I think the pacing was still overall perfectly fine.
What I really liked about this movie, especially in the body, was the methodical nature that diagnosing Regan.
Mm-hmm.
They go through everything before they jump to the conclusion that it's supernatural. It's odd because generally
they run all the science out. Yeah,
why are you assuming that it's supernatural? No, this one they assume it's everything but the supernatural. Mm-hmm. So they have her have CAT scans. They give her a spinal tap, I believe, at one point. They send in psychiatrists, and she's getting worse and more obviously possessed. As her bed shaking, so they think she might be having seizures. They're going through everything, and even Damien.
She gets doped up on so much medication.
Thorazine constantly, which maybe that's why the devil does all this to get hopped up on drugs. But even the priest, the Damien, is like you want to go back in time if you want to get an exorcism. Yeah. They don't do that anymore.
It's just not done.
Yeah. So it's slow, but I felt it was incredibly believable.
I agree with that.
The process this went through.
And I think that the methodical nature of it was really, I think it was well done. Like, while it was, I guess slow is the word that you could use for it. I wasn't like bored really at any point throughout the movie. Like, it was a
slow burn.
I felt like, especially in the middle of the movie, pretty much every scene was useful in progressing the story. And when they thought scenes weren't going to be useful, they just did massive time jumps, or like, and then a week passed or whatever, and this guy's mom died, but that wasn't that important, so we skipped it.
They do it all in dialogue,
Yeah.
too, so it's never on screen like 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's, contextually.
Right, and I mean, I think that's probably a time-saving measure and a measure to like cut out scenes that they didn't think would change the impact of how the film was progressing.
Maybe not, but it was still quite natural. Like I like that about it.
Yeah,
That's
it was.
all.
There's no Chiron that said,
There's
3
no
days
need
later.
for that, yeah.
Yeah, and it came up in dialogue naturally. It wasn't like a pause, and it was not jarring. It didn't take you out of.
Agreed.
Yeah.
The only thing is that the seasons never seem to change.
Well, slightly, because by the end of the film, there's no leaves on the trees. So.
The seasons in the
wasn't
bedroom
looking at it.
changed. That was pretty much it.
We'll say that.
I'm mesmerized by this film. The slow nature of it, I think is so refreshing because I guess we're going to talk about this with style, but the way Friedkin designed every shot, the pace.
Friedkin directed. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But like you were saying before, it was so great to go through, all these things with Reagan, and that pace kind of helped you know how horrific it was, because they could have just shown her on the machine the first time and gotten away with it, but no, they showed like putting the needle in and drawing blood and all that stuff, and how really horrific this is for this little girl. And then the second time she went in for a scan, they skipped all that and put it up there, but he really established all the beats. He really established that you're going through this with these two people, with Chris McNeil and with Father Karras.
They did make it a really visceral experience.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like you kind of felt like you were, going through a lot of this shit while you were watching.
Well, I'm gonna give it a 1.
Yeah, I'm gonna give it a 1 as well.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 1.
And I, too, will give it a 1.
Ones everywhere.
Steve-O, 2 questions. The conclusion. Do you think it was effective? And what do you consider the conclusion?
All right. Well, I'm probably more in Ian's camp, where the climax started with the beginning of the exorcism. That was kind of the beginning. That was kind of the beginning of like the downslope on the roller coaster, where everything had been slowly kind of building up to this, and then as soon as they started, it was like everything was just nuts,
Rapid pace all the way to the end.
Yeah.
That I agree with.
So I think that the film did a really good job. Basically, what happens is the 2 priests going to do this exorcism, and it starts off, and it's just like from the moment they start, the Satan that's in Reagan's body is just flipping out the entire time, really trying to do anything it can to throw them off of their priest game, throwing out a lot of vulgarities and vomiting everywhere. Just a really visceral, like the same as the body, except for everything is like crammed into 25 minutes or half an hour, or however long it is. And it's super visceral. There's all kinds of these, probably at the time, what year did this come out? Do you know exactly?
1973.
73? Probably at the time, like, insane special effects.
Dick Smith?
Just the levitating off the bed levitating, like
Her head spinning
her
around.
head spinning around.
Her levitating as
the
well.
help me thing. I mean, that was more in the body, but like, she at one point
Still,
from inside of her own body spells out "help me" on her stomach.
The only thing I disagree with is I think the pea soup was kind of dated as the vomit. But
But it probably
beyond
looked
that,
great
yeah,
in 1973.
But all the other special effects hold up 100%.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
also the thing about the pea soup is it's gotten into our culture. Anybody
It's
knows
become
now. It's
a
like,
meme.
Yeah, it's
Sure.
like, so by the time you watched it, if you hadn't watched it in the first 5 years, actually, hell, if you haven't watched it in the first 2 years, the pea soup is no longer in the culture.
It's like the
so-
Jaws
Yeah.
effect.
Regardless if I knew whether it was pea soup or not, it didn't.
It looks fake.
Yeah, it looks fake.
But I also wanted to say I thought the very end of the film, where Father Damien takes whatever the hell the demon is, Satan or whatever, into himself and then jumps out the window, is really effective. And they didn't make it too precious. They did a little bit of lingering over it, but they didn't make it too precious of a scene. It was kind of, he took it, had green eyes for a second, struggled, fought it away, and then jumped out a damn window. And it was like, and then it was pretty much done at that point. It was a short after scene where they're moving away, and that was pretty much it.
And one of the priests saying goodbye.
Oh,
One of his
yeah,
great
yeah,
friends.
the other priest,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's Father Dyer.
What I really enjoyed about the conclusion was it actually showed you how dangerous the devil is
Right.
as an antagonist. Because it kills people, or I think it kills one person. Like,
Well, 2 if you count the priest and the
The
director.
Burke.
But did he?
No, but no, I'm talking about before the climax.
Okay.
It only kills the guy Burke, but you don't even see it happen. I don't think you see the body. They just talk about it. So at this time, it's like you're seeing all the same things you've seen from this, like all the monsters, all the cursing, all the weird gesturing and movements. But he actually breaks Damien by constantly harping on his mother,
Using his mother
and
as
then he leaves to take a break and comes back and the other priest is dead. And then Regan, as the devil, is just kind of giggling in the corner of the bed over the priest's dead body. So like they're in such control for most of the exorcism scene that takes one slip up for the devil to become dangerous. And I thought that was so fantastic.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think the beginning of The Exorcist is the third act. It's the payoff for the whole movie and the payoff for the promise of the introduction. I was making a point. But the thing that gets me is the devil one, as you brought out, by his the fallacies of Damien and Marin. And I was going to bring this up later, but I'll bring it up now. Thinking about what our discussions of the introduction and what the introductions were and why, I was thinking in a way, since it seems to be that Chris and Regan are like the pivot people, if in a sense it was to bring these two characters together for this situation, because one had his faith in a frail body and a willingness to know. One person was just every bit of human frailty, and the devil played on one. And then after Marin didn't have a support, he had a heart attack and died. I thought the third act was great. I thought it fulfilled a lot of the promises. And when Karras takes the devil inside of him. To me, that was like his last act of contrition. That was all of his guilt for his whole life, in one last sacrifice. And what I would consider the epilogue is when Regan and Chris were packing up to go, and they see Father Dyer, and Chris says Regan doesn't remember anything to Father Dyer. And Regan comes out, Chris introduces Father Dyer, and she sees a collar and kisses him. So there's some knowledge that she remembers that that somebody who was dressed like this saved her. This ending was just phenomenal.
I definitely agree. It was quite excellent. It was all like we said something. I think Ian said this about Mad Max. It all wraps up rather quickly, but not to a fault. It was perfectly well done. And you mentioned something. They said something else very nicely about his mother. Marin says that the devil will try to lie to you. Don't listen to him. He'll use psychological warfare against you. It's insidious.
Truth with lies.
Yeah,
right.
exactly. And that was a nice little foreshadowing that I thought was well done, and it paid off extremely well at the final battle, if you will. Mm-hmm. And yeah, the final sacrifice was perfectly fine. It made sense to his character. It all brought everything together. And again, I will agree with Chris on one point, but when we get to the question about it, I will explain why. But that's my thoughts on the conclusion.
I think we're done. So
1 for me.
1 for me.
I'll give it a 1 as well.
Yep, same thing.
Okay, to me is the question of themes. Did this film address its themes?
And which themes were they?
What were its themes?
Like the characters, when I messed up all the characters at the beginning, this is a hard one to answer because to me there's a lot of themes going through this. You have the theme of the pursuit of knowledge. You've got the theme of faith. You've got there's themes of loyalty. Overall, arcing is like essentially a ghost story. You basically This is what draws it in. And internally, I think with Regan kissing the priest at the end, and I think there are many themes that go through this film, and I think they're all done really effectively. And I'm sure in our discussion we'll be able to pinpoint them a little more.
Well, if I may, in our first episode of the Halloween special, we talked about Kill Baby Kill.
Kill Baby Kill. Go.
I discussed how it was a classic gothic horror theme. You had the idea of a scientific mind going off into kind of this rural area,
unknown territory,
and confronting the supernatural. The idea that science in the face of the unknown, where it can't answer the questions of the unknown, is a classic thing throughout all of horror. I mean, a lot of the root of horror is in that,
for sure,
or the root of modern horror, I should say. So this kind of almost subverts that idea, where it has our main character is a priest who has lost his faith, and he's now confronted with an enemy that he's been told is his enemy his entire life, but doesn't believe in it anymore. And the mother goes through all of science to combat this unknown, but they have to go back to faith, and that faith requires that great sacrifice. An interesting point is, I want to bring even farther. There's a novel by Stephen King called Salem's Lot, which also involves a priest who has lost his faith and is confronting a vampire at this point. And there's a great scene in that where he finally thinks that he has the willpower to confront this, but I think he holds up the cross and the vampire just laughs at him, and he ends up leaving. He ends up fleeing because he can't deal with this crisis of. Yeah. So in a sense, almost the exact opposite of the reaction that Damien had in this thing. So you're dealing with all these classic themes of science versus the supernatural, and where's the role of faith play in? And as I think as the decades went along, as kind of became a more secular society, the concept, the power of that priesthood starts to fade. And I think that Damien plays that role very interestingly.
I agree with almost all of that, but I wanted to bring something else into light. It's not only that, it's, I think, just the nature of evil, which I think goes back to the introductory scene where when Father Marin finds the little idol, it's a representation of like a demon. Like it obviously is a demonic figure, right? And so he's now like, it covers the fact that the idea of evil is present in all civilizations ever, and when science fails, then what? Right, to your point.
Even more interestingly, I read I think it was Carl Jung book. I was reading the introduction to it. And they were talking about how back during the real formation of psychology, they had to kind of argue that they were a real science. And I think that there's no mistake that they made the Damon a psychologist as well.
Yeah, and I agree with that for sure, yeah.
And that in a sense, the psychologist almost plays the role of the confessor nowadays.
Right.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah,
I get it.
It's the exact same intent there.
Yeah.
So
same relationship, yeah.
And again, I think it's interesting. I don't believe it's a conscious rejection of science, but I think that the idea of a psychologist in there was a really growing concept in the 70s, which we take for granted nowadays. This is kind of like, what if, like the fear of what, not only if science doesn't work, but what if psychology doesn't work?
I think it's a much subtler look at the faith versus science issue than a lot of previous movies, including Kill Baby Kill. I thought that one was more of a like, science can't explain everything type of thing, where this was more like, well, there's a limit to science. It's not that it can't be explained, it's just that we can't explain it right now, perhaps. And there's a point in the film where whoever is inhabiting Reagan's body says backwards English, "I am no one," which I thought was really interesting, and like I'm still like trying to parcel that out in my mind, like what exactly that was trying to say, or what does that mean? Because in the beginning, the first time that she meets Father Damien, she says that she's Satan. He says that he's Satan, or whoever says that they're Satan.
I think they said we,
right?
They did mention multiple people
in
the body.
Yes.
Legion, if you will.
But in that part, when
that was intentional,
he thinks that she's speaking some foreign tongue, she says, "I am no one." And I thought that was kind of an interesting, like, takesies backsies, of what had happened earlier. So I mean, I don't have any explanation as to what that means, but I think it goes into like that idea that the faith versus science thing is not nearly as cut and dried as everybody thinks or wants it to be. It's more of like a gray area of like, where does science leave off, and it's a moving point,
I absolutely agree with all that. I think it was interesting, like, it also subverted. I took this as a subversion in its own way, that Reagan and her mother Chris they're not religious at all. Like, right. In a normal movie, you'd be like, at least somehow connection to it. Like, it's not mentioned. It's not part of their lives at all.
Nope.
And then it just happens. I thought that was a nice little touch.
Well, she's completely against the cross being in the room.
I remember that. Yeah. And it's unclear, like, who she can't. She
never find out who
puts it in there. Yeah. But no, either way, I thought that was a nice little touch, and a good. Again, it touches back upon the topic of they go to all possible scientific answers that they can possibly try to get to, and it still falls short.
I find it interesting that in a way, both priests are scientists and priests. One was a priest doing missionary work based on something he got into archaeology to find this whatever truth he was looking for.
We don't know that.
Well, no. No, but this is what I'm
I think you
extrapolating
can
from the
imply
character.
that, though.
I think you can apply that pretty well, because if he's on an archaeological dig, there's some part of him that's using
That's what I was saying
whatever
earlier.
whatever science is available to achieve that, to do that. And Father Karras, when he said, I've been with the Jesuits my whole life, they paid for medical school and so forth, and he went to Harvard and all this stuff. You kind of seem that one approach gets to science from faith, and one gets from faith to science, because by the end, Karras has lost his faith, but Marin still has his faith.
And they
I agree
both
with
die
that.
anyway, so
Yeah.
nothing doesn't matter.
Faith doesn't save anyone.
Which is also a theme apparently.
So I'm going to give it a 1.
I am also going to give my explanation 1.
Yep, 1 from me as well.
Yeah, I'll give it a 1. I thought it was a pretty depthy movie. I really liked.
I thought it captured all the classical horror themes. Well.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Actually, I just wanted to make one last point. If this movie were made nowadays, they'd probably have her
Protests.
attempt. No, they'd probably have her attempt to go to like a New Age healer as well, because like it's like right after the
I see what you
psychologist there, and
That would be the
just wanted to add
in-between
Yeah.
step.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yep, sure.
Okay, Ian, how was the antagonist, and who do you think was the antagonist or the antagonists?
The antagonist is Satan, obviously. Oh, I don't know if it's Satan or if it's one of his.
Could it be Satan?
Could be just some other demon saying they're
Yeah,
Satan.
it could be. He's the liars after all.
Yeah.
So, but regardless, the Legions of
Liars all the way
Hell
down.
are always a fantastic villain, and I thought that what Linda Blair was reading. Thought she did a phenomenal job being this like possessed little girl. I really despised her acting before that, but she did a phenomenal like son of a bitch. So. That's all I have to say.
I absolutely agree with that. So, like, yeah, wasn't that, like, Steve brought up an interesting point when they play it backwards and it's that the voice says, I am no one. That's a very nice touch. But again, you also, like, at the same other side of the coin, Satan, of course, is the greatest liar, deceiver ever, in mythology. So, either way,
Trust
all I'm
nothing.
saying is, yeah, both of those are great. And I think also just, like, unexplained, scary events are going to be the antagonists, broadly as well, which is of course a big trope in horror films.
It's the worst antagonist ever.
Is Loki a better
Yes.
liar than Satan?
No, they're equal. They're both great at their jobs.
When you lie about everything, how can you be a better liar?
When your job is to deceive and lie, then you're supposedly the best one in each your respective mythology. It's equal, It's two CEOs of lying incorporated. But either way, I agree with that, and I also agree with her portrayal. Like, she did a good job when she was supposed to be possessed. She portrayed herself as threatening. So
Yeah, I don't have much more to say on top of that. I think that Linda Blair did a great job, the actress, and I think that the director did a hell of a job making her have a path of a path to evil. That's about it for me. I don't know if you have more to add, Chris.
No, I wouldn't. I was trying to figure out if I should ask this thing or not, but when you keep bringing up the I am no one, I always took that as I am no one, I am everyone. Like, that was part of that thing. Like,
I like that,
it was. Then we might get to the dialogue, but
evil could be in anybody,
right?
Yeah.
But you're telling about that, kind of derailed me, and then I was like thinking about,
But I agree with that
going
too.
the Scott level of antagonists about it not being society, but it being society. That there's like
Of course, yeah.
greater antagonists besides just the one that they put on the screen. Either way, yeah.
All right,
So
1 for me.
I'm gonna give it a 1.
One.
I'm giving it 1.
All right.
All right, we're
Now,
perfect so far.
All right, Steve-O, protagonist or protagonists?
I think this one is Scott.
Oh, sorry, Scott.
I initially, again, because this was a slow burn, yeah, he had a good setup. Like, again, we'll go back to the quote unquote.
Who's your
introduction.
protagonist?
Damien, of course.
Okay,
He's number
just
one.
him.
Yes. Well, let me talk about him first, and then I'll talk my way through it. He definitely, of course, is the main major protagonist. Again, it was a slow-ish introduction, but it was still all fine. And actually, as you said, when he visits his mother the first time, that actually gives you a lot of information, like right off the bat. Pretty much, you see a window into his life. And also, I think when he goes to the bar, I think that's where he says when he meets up with Dwyer. I think, right?
It wasn't Dyer. It was another priest.
Okay,
Yeah.
he meets up with another priest. He's first of all, he's smoking in his mother's apartment, and he's having a beer at the local bar, and he says, "I think I lost my faith," and that's pretty much where he's at in his life. And then he goes through this whole journey of trying to being a psychologist, being a Harvard, medically trained at Harvard and so forth, and being confronted with a supernatural-ish event that conflicts his faith and his science parts of him conflict with himself. I thought that was all very well done. I think Maron becomes a protagonist as well when he comes back.
No way.
I think he does.
No way. He's strictly supporting.
I think Chris is supporting, and everyone else. And all her
I would
servants.
say Chris is much more of a major character, a protagonist than Maron is.
I think she's just secondary.
I'm going to
nerd
out here.
Right.
Is Obi-Wan Kenobi a protagonist?
No.
And Maron is Obi-Wan Kenobi of this movie.
Alright. That's funny. That's a good analogy. I don't know if I fully agree with it, but I see your point. I think to me, though,
he's an older mentor who's wise in the ways of supernatural
but it becomes a buddy
and
film.
Dies.
I would say it becomes a buddy film in the last third.
How long? I believe that Anthony Hopkins played Hannibal Lecter more than Maron was in the main movie.
Maybe. But I still think he's that integral. It opens with him. He's the prologue. It connects back to his story. He has a whole arc unto himself. And he sort of, he imparts the knowledge, or he helps out Damien in the end by sacrificing himself, and then Damien sacrifices himself in a sense. That's all I'm saying. All I'm saying is to you is I count him as the main character, and therefore they both get a good review from me.
And just to my reference I made previously, Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs only played 16 minutes, and that's what I was referring to.
All right, fine.
So.
I would argue that Regan is a main character, is a protagonist. I think that you learn a lot about who she has lost through who she becomes, who her I think that she
just a good point.
She has a pretty good, I hesitate to say character arc because it's her becoming another character, but she has the most at stake in this throughout most of the movie.
All right, fair enough.
And she's kind of the one that you're rooting, quote unquote, should be rooting for throughout most of the movie. And I think that this film does a good job of kind of subverting the normal protagonist, underlying architecture. And in terms of the other main characters, I would say Damien and Chris. I don't know if I would say Maron.
May I make a point about Regan though? Do you ever see aside from one shot that I can think of, do you ever see the movie from her point of view? The only time I can think of is when she's listening in on the phone conversation her mother's having with the father.
Right.
But do you ever follow her story?
That's a very good point. I agree with that. You both make good points about it.
No, I guess just that part. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
And that's a very quick scene. It cuts away pretty quickly after.
Yeah, but that's a big part of the story. She has this father that's not around.
Yeah, but I don't think granted, she is a major supporting character. But I don't think that we ever follow her on her journey. Every time we follow her, we're following her through her mother's eyes.
Through somebody else's eyes. Yeah, I agree with that.
You're seeing her in the hospital from
and her mother's watching.
Without question, Damien is the main character. But I'm going to say Chris is a semi-equal protagonist because with Damien, you've got somebody who speaks for science, but you as a symbol of religion. From an audience standpoint, you're approaching this movie from the secular, and you can approach it from the religious.
That's a fair point.
And it pays each respect. It criticizes and compliments each at the same time. Chris, which is funny that she's an actress, now becomes the audience. What's going through her and through her discovery is the audience being able to explore these different worlds, which Damien is simultaneously representing.
Actually, you brought up something that I wanted to bring up in themes but forgot. So I'd like to jump back there for a second, if you will. This movie portrays science horrifically. They're showing the mother in the hospital surrounded by all of these kind of comatose patients and all that. They show the visceral pain of science of the blood squirting as needles.
All the stuffed shirt doctors and
It is not a nice representation that they put in there. I just thought that was interesting.
I think it's reasonable. Sure, it's not but it shows you the harsh realities of what science is doing, what medical profession is all about.
Right, and back then they were a little less touchy-feely. But also, the point, I like the juxtaposition of Karras couldn't afford his mom to go anywhere, couldn't go to a real hospital. So she essentially ended up in Bellevue, whereas Chris, because of, she had money and so forth, she got the best specialist.
80
she had like
psychologists, whatever she said.
She had psychologists making house calls.
Yeah.
I mean, how many doctors will make a fucking house call? I mean,
True.
So I mean, it kind of the juxtaposition of the two, I think,
That's
is
a good
really,
point.
really cool.
And from the fact that a priest theoretically has more value in society than an actress does, it's interesting how
Sure.
like he's getting paid nothing.
Okay.
Well, I'm giving it a 1. Of course.
Wait, do we decide who the protagonist is though?
Well, whoever we thought were the protagonist, I think we're all going to
Who are
make the
your
score either way.
protagonists?
Mine, I'm going to go with Damien and Chris was the
Chris.
other. Yeah, because I think that those are the two you follow the majority of the movie with.
I agree.
You convinced me, Damien, her, and Marin. I still count him as a protagonist. Sorry, I just do. Fuck off. Power of Christ compels me.
You're wrong on air. It's terrible.
No, Power of Christ compels me to count him.
I would agree that it's probably that. I guess Reagan is not a protagonist, like a main character. Chris and Damien, but
She's an interesting case, but she's just not main.
they did a good job, and I'm gonna give that a 1 as well.
All right.
I just want to make all this point. I like how she since she's an actress, she has all she's very well made up at the beginning of the movie. I don't think her character progresses much through this, but you're watching her get more and more haggard and kind of irrational as the movie goes on.
She gets more desperate.
I thought it was very well. So I'm going to give it a 1.
And I'm definitely giving it a 1.
All right.
Okay, now, Steve-O, the supporting cast.
All right, so the supporting cast is the majority of the supporting cast is mainly made up of faceless priests and doctors, who are all pretty much useless.
Well,
then
not the priest.
Most of the priests are
The
pretty
faceless
much
priests are
useless.
useless.
Yeah.
Fair
And then there's Marin, Reagan, and
Columbo.
Oh, the cop who I love, but is so forgettable.
I guess Burke is also a.
I'm going to count.
Burke.
I'm going to speak to that.
We can talk more
There's
about it.
one more you guys are
The
forgetting.
officer's name's Lieutenant Kinderman, and
Columbo.
and then we discussed Burke Dennings and
And what's his friend's name?
Carl.
Oh yeah, the Nazi butler.
Well, I know.
And the live-in
Sharon. Yeah.
So given all that, that's
given all of that,
that's who you have to choose from.
I think that it was a really, I think there was felt like a full world. There were a lot of good supporting characters that really made this seem like there was something at stake.
And I agree with you. The supporting cast in this is really, really, really strong. And I like the fact that, Chris has her confidant in Sharon. And you learn about Chris through Sharon and Reagan. And to an extent, the butlers and the maid.
I don't know what the maid's name is. Doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Sorry.
The German couple. And Karis has Father Dyer.
That's what I was trying to
Yeah, Father Dyer. And it's great because everybody's got their own sounding board. And then when the Detective Columbo comes in, he elicits other information out of these two. But it's interesting the approach they take with the supporting characters and how they are affected and how they affect the protagonists.
Very much. I want to talk about Columbo because I thought he was a completely needless character. He was exactly what the introduction was. They have him there for a long time. And nothing
is
ever
negated
comes
in
of
the
it.
end. Yeah, I think you're kind of right about that.
But he was awesome. I loved him.
Yeah, but no, I think
and it's the best. He was stuck with all that paperwork at the end of it. At the end of the movie.
Yeah, but what I liked about him is he was this outside presence, and he could throw out some exposition that nobody else could. Like, did you know?
The body and
the body of Burke Dennings, the head was twisted all the way around, and then it was apparent he was murdered before he was thrown out a window.
They kind of dwelled on his character for a very, very long time, though. Or at least I was aware of his presence, and it felt dragging every time he was on screen.
I enjoyed him. I really did.
I'm leaning Chris's camp. Like, he was fine. Was he completely necessary? No, probably not. But I think the moments he was on screen, I think were pretty good.
But to what Steve said, it made a real complete world because everything was so naturalistic. So you had this police officer, and he's talking to Chris, and he's just like, "Oh, one more thing. He's already established when we talked to Father Karras that he was a movie fanatic." And he goes to Chris, he goes, "Can I, for my daughter, get an autograph?" And she goes, "Sure. What's your daughter's name?" And he's like, "It's for me."
Sure.
It's not necessary,
It was a fine character moment, but had zero relevance to the plot.
That's a subjective.
But why?
Yeah,
but why is that? That's one of the things I find refreshing about movies like this. It's not a series of quick cuts. It's not a series of this is what you need to know. It's like these slice of life things. It's these little things about the characters that you wouldn't normally know that really don't mean anything, but kind of add to the flavor of the world.
And that's all fine. In our grand tradition of if one or two side characters, secondary supporting, does a good job, I think the fight between Burke and Carl was a really funny
that
moment.
Was brilliant.
And that, that might give it give me a good review on its own.
I never understood why Burke and Chris were an item.
He was. It's like a Quentin
I don't
Tarantino.
think they were an item.
Yeah, but she said, "Oh, he comes over because I'm lonely" or something like that.
Yeah,
right. I like it. It kind of felt like they were just friends, and
Reagan calls her out on it.
More into it than.
And she's like, "No, honey, I'm just fucking around with this."
I think it was an Uma Thurman and Tarantino's kind of situation, is what I'm saying. So I got out of that.
Maybe.
But either way, I like all those, and it's funny because almost like Reagan herself could be a supporting character. Like Satan is. Via her, she's a supporting character via that, but
so
she's both.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Every time Reagan was on screen without Satan, did you like her?
Not at the beginning, but afterwards, yes.
She wasn't really meant to be her own character. Like I was saying before, like she was more of an extension of Chris. You found out about her and Chris. She drew stuff out of Chris.
It was fine in the end, and I count her as such.
Out about Chris.
I count her actual side of her and not Satan's side of her as a secondary character.
Which is also interesting because if you look at Chris, you get to see how she's with the director and the people in the business, and how she is with the help, and how she is with her assistant. It's just, and then, all Father Karras has is Father Dyer, and his uncle and his mom. Yes, I don't really consider Reagan her own character. I mean, she's definitely a supporting character, but she's literally just a vehicle for Chris.
She's the catalyst, as you said, yeah.
She's a vehicle for Chris, and it's a vehicle for Satan.
Sure.
Just test driving Reagan.
Okay.
And
so having said all that,
for the score,
I'm giving it a 0.
Are you really?
One for me.
I'm giving it a 1. I thought that, like I said, it felt like a really full and diverse world.
A realized world. Yeah.
I believe that down the line, I'm not going to remember one single supporting character.
Even Reagan?
I don't think she's a supporting character. I agree with Chris that she's what moments we see of her is an extension of Chris's character. More, and Reagan as a person, I thought was incredibly annoying. No offense, Linda Blair, but just a little kid made me twitchy all around.
Fair enough.
And I do. Before I answer this, I do consider Father Merrin a supporting character, but that does not minimize his importance to the film. I'm just saying that the film bookended with him, that it was important that he did contribute something to the overall story. But the through lines were definitely Chris and Damien. I'm giving this a 1 because I loved all the characters, whether they were supporting characters that were important to the film, supporting characters that were catalysts for our protagonists, or just
background flavor
extra
characters.
Flavor. Like there was no reason to show that thing between Carl and Dennings, but it was awesome.
I agree.
All right, well, hang on. So Ian, you don't consider Reagan herself to be a character at all in this film?
If I'm going to count her as a character, it's going to be as an extension of Chris's character, and that's how I would rate it. I say that she's a supporting character, yes, but on that point, that doesn't change my answer.
And then you're not going to remember Marin?
I will remember Marin, but I don't love him as much as the rest of the people here do, and I think that he was significantly. He was almost the main driving force was Damien. It was his story. Marin was playing the role of
of Obi-Wan, as you said.
Of Obi-Wan, yeah. And it's sort of you see a bunch of him at the beginning. He shows up, is all business, and then dies.
Right.
And could it have been done differently? Probably. I enjoyed the character, but I don't think he's strong enough to pull it up from the rest of the supporting cast.
Okay. All right.
Okay. And the next one's to me, and that would be dialogue. And I love this dialogue. I think what was a great juxtaposition was when you actually see Chris on set and she's delivering this monologue in this movie, and you're sitting here going, wow, this is a monologue from a movie. It's terrible. But it was but every other single conversation in the film, whether it was something inane between Chris and Reagan, or whether it was a conversation between Damien and his mom, or things that Satan said through Reagan, or the argument between Dennings and Carl, I thought I never once thought I'm watching a script, because there's two ways to do a movie. You do it very naturalistically, what I would think this is, or you basically write a symphony like Glengarry Glen Ross, right? There's a rhythm to everything. There's anything in the middle is kind of, suspect. It can be terrible, good or bad. But I consider this to be on the positive extreme, very naturalistic dialogue, and I thought it was great.
I think for the most part you're right, but I found a lot of the early dialogue, and I know you're going to agree with this, Ian, and probably Scott, with Chris and Reagan, I found it almost cringeworthy.
Yes, not almost.
But
it was. Yeah.
But I also found it, as you just said, kind of natural and like this, mother-daughter lovey type, like.
I would cringe at that in real life.
Exactly.
Well. Yeah,
exactly. Like I didn't find it unrealistic. I just found it cringeworthy. Yeah.
You're right. It wasn't unnatural, but it was so saccharine, like, But that's what people would say in real life, and you'd be like, in real life as well.
Exactly.
So I agree with that. This is one of the hardest ones for me to think about, because I want to give it a 0, but because that's how people speak in real life, and I hate people in real life speaking like that as well. So
I think if Satan was not in this movie,
the dialogue would be Satan.
I would give it a 0.
There would be no movie.
But like the idea is, if
I agree with that.
I would have given it a 0 or a soft 1 depending on my mood at the time.
All right.
But because Satan is in there, and it just like
You're right.
your mother sucks cocks in hell,
Yeah.
like it's incredibly. I still hear people quoting like the movie nowadays.
You're right.
Very
All right. You guys convinced me.
Horror
Like,
movie nerds, but still.
I'm gonna give it, like, at the end of the day, I'm gonna give it a positive review. It's just that because it reflected real life so well, perhaps, and maybe that's a credit to it. It's just that when people speak like that in real life, I myself cringe. But it wasn't stilted. I guess my two criteria is it wasn't stilted and it wasn't flat. So therefore, it was all good.
And if this was a different movie without that, I believe you would have described this as the dialogue was serviceable.
Yeah,
it moved the plot
You're
along.
right. Exactly. I would. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's probably. And I thought there was a lot of good dialogue, especially.
There were good moments.
Well, I think
overall,
that I think that
between the priests, I thought there was a lot of good dialogue, and kind of. I thought that Chris was really natural in her like defense of her daughter and like getting really worked up about everything. Like it just made sense for the way that her character had been portrayed throughout the rest of the movie. Before that, to like where she got to when she was just completely unnerved and like going crazy, basically towards the second 2/3 of the movie. Chris, you're gonna say something?
What I really enjoyed about the dialogue about this movie is it serviced the characters well. Okay, I was not really interested in Chris and Reagan because that storyline, as before any supernatural element
on
shows
papers,
up, I don't really care about them. But I was really interested in what Father Marin was talking about in the Iraq parts, and I was really interested in finding out about Damien Karras. I was really interested in his life. I loved all the dialogue between Dyer and Karras, and I thought all the dialogue said so much about these people, whether you cared about what they were saying or not.
2 points. I just remember this is dated boxing references.
Yeah.
Which confused the hell out of me. But nonetheless, I'm also disappointed that Damien, who looks exactly like Fonzie, didn't go, "Hey," at some point.
right after the Exorcist.
Fairly certain that this came out before Happy Days.
What?
Wasn't Happy Days out in like the late 70s?
It doesn't matter. We're cutting all this out.
76.
All right. Anyways, anyone have anything else to say about dialogue?
Not at all.
I'm giving it a 1.
I'm giving it a 1.
You guys convinced me. I'm giving it a 1.
I'm giving it a 1.
Ones.
And to Ian, there's a question of style.
This is a 70s horror film in all the best ways possible. You can see all like the techniques and the colors and the shots that they use in like The Omen, in Halloween. Actually, there's a scene that's straight out of Halloween where right at the beginning with the music, that one of the great horror movie soundtracks playing as Chris is walking down the street.
Yeah.
Like I expected Michael Myers to appear from around the corner. But it's like, besides the pacing, it has all the great elements that went into like this 70s horror genre, and I think this is a great example of it. Or Rosemary's Baby is another great one, and this is just one of those great pieces. So.
I definitely agree with that. It's like the opening, of course, back to the intro, like long shots, like vistas, I think were good. There's a lot of the jump cuts were perfectly cut up how they needed to be. And also, I think the use of shadows and fog and so forth.
Yeah.
When it was very cold in the bedroom, and everyone's like every time they walked into it, like you could see everyone's breath. There was like ice forming on things. The attention to detail and things like that, I think, was quite good. And as Ian said, yeah, it's a standout example of how to do, of 70s horror that set the tone for every horror movie to come afterwards.
Yeah, the thick fog around the house when Marin shows up, and it's that poster, shot of The Exorcist of him standing there with his hat on, like
by the lamppost.
Yeah, with the
right outside
briefcase
the
or
house,
whatever. Great shots. Cinematography throughout was terrific. Good soundtrack. The music and ambiance kept it going. Like the the sounds throughout. Really had a visual narrative that kept up throughout, and like kind of it got darker and foggier and creepier as it went on, and then at the end it was at the very end it was like all bright and everything, and they were leaving and starting a new life. I thought they did a great job.
Amongst the cinematography, which is brilliant, I love the way he sets up every shot. I love the look of the cuts, and everything was fantastic. But somebody brought up color, and I thought it was interesting that at the beginning of the film you see the landscape shot, but it's first in black and white and then fades into color. And then when Marin shows up, it's foggy and so forth. And for all intents and purposes, except for like a little yellow, it might as well be black and white. And at the end, when Dyer's at the top of the staircase, and we had just come from saying goodbye to Chris where it was sunny, here you're in more of an alley, and it's not black and white.
It's sun setting. It's like washed out.
It's washed out, yeah.
Yes.
The initial scene, the initial shot is the sun in Iraq, and it looks black and white at first, and then the color slowly fades in, which I thought was a really cool technique as well. It's just, this movie is full of stuff like that. I'm sure there are books about it.
So zeros across the board?
Yeah.
I think it's all ones, right?
I believe ones across the board.
I believe this is ones.
Yeah.
And finally, Scott, would you recommend this movie?
Yes, I would. Definitely. It's a classic for a reason, of course. And you know what? It's funny because I wasn't sure how well, like, given that it's, 30 years, it's not 1973 you said it was made in.
Yep.
Oftentimes, like, yes, they were good for the time, but does it stand up? This one clearly did. And for sure, check it out. It's, a pillar of horror movies, and there would be everything that followed in its footsteps. It paved the way for all of those.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say about it other than if you haven't seen it, go see it. And as far as horror films go, I keep saying I'm not the biggest fan of horror films, but I keep finding good horror films to watch. And
Frankenstein's Army, man.
Yeah, Frankenstein's Army, dude. It actually was a pretty good
Check
movie.
that one out. As a
but this one is clearly top of its game in film in general, not even just in the horror genre.
Sure.
Very well said, because I was going to say, I saw this movie when I was 8 years old. I never had a chance. Blazing Saddles at 6, this at 8, Alien and Dracula at 9. So, but I saw this when I was 8 years old, and it scared the shit out of me. And since then, to Steve-O's point, it doesn't scare me anymore. It's just this. I look at it as a film now.
You appreciate for the art that it is.
Yeah, I appreciate. That's exactly right. I appreciate for the art it is. I enjoy everything about this movie, and I can't recommend it enough.
I was trying to find something wrong with this movie, and so here's gonna be my if there's something wrong with this movie,
here it is.
Here it is. This movie is all atmosphere and cinematography and beauty, but it's done at a sacrifice to some character development throughout. Maybe not all the narration, I mean the protagonists, but they focus a lot on building this tension, this atmosphere.
I see what you mean, but still.
It's absolutely fantastic for that. So again, it's a near perfect movie, but there are things that you can find flaws at.
Sure.
So that's my go watch it.
Yes.
So I believe we all recommend it.
Yeah. And
the power of Christ compels you to watch this movie.
And Ian, could you give us the final scores?
Okay, so it is a 10s all around except for me, who gave it a 9. So that's a 9.75 for The Exorcist.
Fairly decent.
That's about right.
Score.
Yeah.
So, exercise that 0.25.
The power of Christ compels you to watch this.
Indeed.
Or the power of MOTS, I guess.
And that concludes part 2 of MOTS-O-Ween, the 1970s. I am Christopher Morgan. I am here with Ian J. Manzer. Ian Manzer.
Yes.
Go on. Who else are you here with?
I'm here with Scott Thurlow.
Power of Christ compels you to fuck up Ian's name.
And Steve Ramosi.
Okay. Bye, y'all. I don't know why I said y'all.
Fuck that.
This Saturday, we'll be doing a live review of Halloween, the movie, at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on our YouTube channel. So please come join us.
This has been Bon Mots. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Music by Chris Morgan. Editing and engineering by Stephen Hermosi. This has been a Los Angeles production. All rights reserved.